This is fantastic. We had a great day yesterday. We heard about the rollout of the IDF framework and the registry. We heard some really good pilot stuff. So today we have a more fun-filled, action-packed agenda. So here's our agenda. We're going to be hearing about the next chapter of the IDSG. I don't know if Sal is here yet, so we might have to skip that. That will be you? Okay. Well, Jen will open us up and tell us the next chapter and the next generation. We'll do our standards registry overview with David Temashok from NIST. We'll do our standards vote. I'm sorry, that'll be Renee McIver and Jen.
Yeah, I gotta be next across the street at
Okay.
CIS.
Busy. You're a busy person because you're an important person, Jen. There you go. We'll have our FMO report from James Bryce Clark, and we'll do our wrap up with Jen and Renee, and then we'll have breakout sessions. So remember, you need to be IDF registered. So please go to the www.idefregistry.org and sign your company's products up right away. So without further ado, Jen Behrens.
Thank you. Can I get the clicker? Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. I'm not actually sure if I need to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway, just to cover our bases. So all contributions are subject to the IDSG transparency requirements. By making contributions to IDSG or its committees, each organizational member or individual member consents to its public posting, circulation, and archiving, and waives the rights to the contrary. So officially, everyone, welcome back to day 2 of our plenary. Glad to see so many of you back. You made it back from last night. And those of you that have dialed in, welcome. We are glad and appreciate that you've taken that time. I do hope that last night was fun and that not too many bad decisions were made. Some are okay. We do, as MA said, have another great day of IDSG business ahead of us. In a few minutes, we're going to hear from David Temashok about the standards registry and what it means for a standard to be listed on the registry. Then Renee will present the standard that we'll be taking action on over the course of the next week through electronic ballot. Following that, we will hear from Jamie from the Framework Management Office. He's going to provide us with a review of our recent activities and provide a vision of next steps in order to keep delivering on the requirements for our grant with NIST. This afternoon, we have 3 more exciting breakout sessions for everyone. We have the Privacy Coordination Committee that's going to be looking at what the heck we're going to do with the PIM. TIFTM Committee is going to have a working session, and the Functional Model Group will meet to talk about profiles and continue their work. We'll grab lunches before, as MA said, and then we're going to head to the breakout rooms for the sessions. While we will technically close this plenary today at noon or whenever we're done today, this morning, please feel free to continue these conversations and dialogues. If they're fruitful, I believe we might be able to have little pockets of rooms still like we did yesterday. All right. When we leave here today, we're going to continue working and driving. We're going to be dialing in. We're going to keep having our constructive conversations. We're going to do this with the sense of teamwork and positive spirit that I have found pervasive in this organization. While I haven't been around since the start, I am entering my 4th year with this group, the IDSG. I've witnessed and participated in its growth, its expansion, its contraction, the hits that we've taken, the wins that we've scored, and everything in between. I love the work that is being produced by this group. I know the meaning of it, and I believe in its mission and importance. This group is also so much more than that, and until this week, I had a hard time identifying what that sense or what that being was. This week, more than any other, has highlighted that to me, that special, tangible feeling that I have about this group. We're a family. We ebb and we flow. We fuss and we fight and we make up. We put our heads down when we need to get tasks accomplished. We negotiate with each other. We bargain, we compromise, we accomplish. We laugh, we enjoy each other, we cheer each other on, we have each other's backs. And when the need arises, we take care of each other. we rally, and we show up. This group, you all that are sitting here, those that are dialed in, and those that couldn't make it, we're family. We take turns in our various roles, the cousins who fade in and out, the old-timers who act as our sage advisors and give us perspective, the young babies who bring enthusiasm and new ideas, the mommy and daddy who are both our biggest supporters and our toughest critics, the occasional uncle that everyone knows a little bit off, but we still find value in, and we welcome them into our circle. This sense of family has gotten us to this point. The amazing release of an incredible product, the IDEF registry, in the face of numerous barriers and despite the march of time. For me, I'm proud and thankful to be part of this family, and I'm looking forward to helping you all accomplish it in the committees over the next year so that we can keep driving forward and making the market impact that we all know is there. And I know that you all will be there for it too. So again, thank you for helping us and for being part of this wonderful family. And we're going to keep on going. We're going to go to David to talk to us about the standards registry.
Thanks, Jen. So, what I'm going to talk about this morning isn't new. In fact, we talked about this 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. But a funny thing happens whenever we have standards up for adoption in the IDESG. It's one of our processes, by the way. I'll cover it a little bit. Funny thing happens. Email chains and questions rise. What does it mean to adopt and approve standards and put them in the registry? Are they normative? Are they required? How do they relate to the baseline requirements? What's the relationship with the inventory? So we talked about this, and it's kind of laid out, by the way, a couple years ago. I felt it would help if we just have a presentation that's focused just on the standards registry and what it means, what the standards that are in the registry means, and how it relates to the other things in the IDESG, so that we can point to that as we get near to standards, a standards approval or adoption process like we're going to have after I talk about this. So it kind of segues into that, just to make sure that the folks that might not have been around 2 years ago or more when we actually developed the standards adoption policy know how this stuff fits and works together and how it relates. So that's what we're going to be doing today. And for those that were around and helped to develop the standards adoption policy or the update, yeah, stay tuned and help us go through this. So a little bit of background on the standards adoption policy itself. Version 1 was basically developed in 2014, approved in December 2014 by the Plenary. Version 2 been a work in progress for the Standards Coordination Committee and was approved last month as an update and improvement on the process itself. Not a lot of adjustment to the policies, however, so that's why I say there's a lot of the policies that I'm going to talk about really were established a couple years ago. And in a kind of summary statement, what the standards adoption policy does, it establishes both the policies as well as the processes by which the IDESG and its committees and processes get to the point where we evaluate, approve, and adopt standards for use in the identity ecosystem. And I'll go into a little bit of discussion of what that means. And you can see the purpose statement that's from the for the standards adoption policy, that's from the policy itself. And one of the things it says is the standards adoption policy is, the purpose is to provide a formal process that goes through the Standards Coordination Committee, goes through full plenary approval and adoption, to be able to establish standards that contribute to the framework. And this is my personal view on it. I think that the standards registry and the standards that are adopted in the registry are in fact part of the ongoing framework. But I'll explain in this as we go forward how that relates to the baseline requirements as well as the best practices that we have in the formal framework document. The policy establishes one of the things that the standards adoption policy does, it establishes the standards inventory and the standards registry. And this is a description from the policy itself. And you can read through this, but I want to bring out just a couple of points. It is a listing of standard specifications and similar materials. The policy itself looks to standards open standards that have been put forward by a standards development organization through a consensus-based process, an open process, but it's not restricted to that. So specifications, profiles, other forms of standards and directions that may or may not have originated from a recognized standards development organization can be posted in the inventory and in fact go through the standards be nominated for evaluation in the standards adoption process. This is not a standards adoption process 101 discussion, but just to make sure that we understand that the standards adoption process evaluates both the standards based on criteria that are in the process, that are in the policy itself, as well as the organization that produced that, to make sure that both meet criteria that have been established in the approved policy. Second thing I want to point out about the inventory is any member can post standards to the standards inventory. It's a listing. Third thing that's important is there's no evaluation that the IDESG does on the standards that are in the inventory. These are standards that our members think have relevance within the identity management domain, but haven't been determined appropriate at this stage to be nominated as a standard for the registry. So consider it a big holding tank of inventory, an inventory of standards that we can point to, a reference guide that should be helpful for folks both within the IDESG and those external coming in. Now, the registry itself is, and again, you can read through this. This is from the policy, but I want to bring out a couple of points on this as well. The registry is, anybody in the IDESG can nominate standards for the standards adoption process. Now, the standards adoption process involves evaluating the standards as well as the originating organization to meet certain criteria that are outlined in the standards adoption policy. And the registry is an artifact that complements the framework. And I'll explain a little bit what I mean by complements the framework. Here we say, use the term supports the framework, and because the mission of the IDESG is both to build the framework and the baseline requirements, but also adopt standards that support that framework and the identity ecosystem. And that's what the registry does. And both the inventory and the registry are posted on a IDESG wiki page, separate pages, that list all of the standards in the inventory, and you can go and check as a guide, as it should, what the standard is and access that through the inventory, and the registry lists those standards that have been approved and adopted by the IDESG and are in the registry. So what does all this mean? The inventory, as I said, is a listing of standards relevant to the identity management domain, not approved, not evaluated. It's not an evaluative listing. It is a reference listing. The standards registry presents the standards that have been approved or adopted, they're synonymous terms, in the standards adoption policy by the IDESG and are recommended for use. So we're pointing to the registry and say these standards have been evaluated and have been approved by the IDESG and are recommended for use in the identity ecosystem by service providers. So on the third bullet, the standards inventory is informative. The standards registry is recommended. But neither one is normative. They aren't requirements. The only place in the IDESG library of documents where requirements are established are in the baseline requirements of the framework. Now, the baseline requirements may point to a standard or a set of standards as a requirement. That security wants to point to a particular set of security standards as kind of a blanket requirement. Could do that. Requirements that are, or standards that are required in any of the baseline requirements, conformance to these standards, those standards must be in the registry. The relationship of the registry to the baseline requirements is if you're going to require a standard, right now none do in the baseline requirement. None of the baseline requirements require implementation of any standard. But the IDESG can get there as requirements become more specific. But if any committee is going to require and standards, point to them as a requirement, then those standards must be in the registry. One of the things that the baseline requirement does is it also lists supplemental guidance. Now, the supplemental guidance is not normative. The normative requirements are the statements in the baseline requirements. However, as part of the supplemental guidance, there also are references. And the references point to key references and key documents, including standards, that may help a reader of the baseline requirement to understand the baseline requirement. May help those organizations that are applying to the IDEF registry to better understand the baseline requirement and determine where they stand in implementing and conforming to that requirement. But those references are non-normative, and they could include standards. Right now, we did not do a one-to-one match, check, or requirement that any standard that's a reference in the baseline requirements, in the guidance, in the supplemental guidance, also be in the registry. Because in fact, in cases they're not. It would be a goal for the IDESG to do that. So that as we go through the baseline requirements, one of the things the FMO is doing, JB may cover this in his discussion of FMO activities, is going through those references. And where we do have standards that are key references in the supplemental guidance to the baseline requirements, make sure that we follow the standards adoption process, make sure they're in the inventory, nominate those for evaluation and subsequent presentation and approval and adoption by the overall IDESG plenary. So that's one of the tasks ahead, to make sure that the baseline requirements, the supplemental guidance, and the registry all complement each other as they should. Now, I'd like to kind of illustrate what that use of the registry would be, not just would look like, but would be in the baseline requirements from a real case example. The Standards Coordination Committee wanted to point to standards and actually do what I just described, require that standards that are used for authentication transaction data exchange, this says, I'll cover what the Interop 4 says in just a minute, but I wanted to ensure that data interface standards were used that were approved in the registry for authentication transactions in the identity ecosystem. However, when we were developing the baseline requirements, we only had one standard that defined those types of transactions in the registry SAML 2.0. So it wasn't, our baseline requirement wasn't to the point where we could actually point to the registry as these are the standards to be used for these types of transactions. So the requirement itself was made more general, referring to any communications and data exchanges must use open, must point to and use public and open standards, because we weren't sure, we didn't really have all of the standards covered that even in the inventory. So in the best practice section of the baseline requirements, this is Interop best practice B, what we kind of signal is where we are intending to go in the IDESG on this. And you can see that the direction was we would like for data interchange, and specifically for transactions involving data interchange for authentication transactions, attribute exchange transactions, or in general other transactions where data is exchanged in the identity ecosystem, to use standards that are approved in the identity ecosystem registry. But if we're not there yet, at least point to those that are in the inventory. So we're giving a signal to industry as well as to the IDESG on the best practice of where we intend to go on this, which means we have to be a little bit more diligent in our standards nomination process, and a little bit more effective in the speed of our evaluations, because the intention is that we're able to have a direct relationship between baseline requirements and standards that are in the registry, but we've got to ensure that we're covering what we need, what we want to see, and what we can put out to the industry, as appropriate standards for interoperability in both the baseline requirements and the registry. And I'll say one more thing on this. I've been speaking of standards, but one of the first things that I said was that standards as that are defined in the standards adoption process can be specifications, profiles within a standard. So there might be communities that have taken a standard that's in the registry and present as a nominated profile or specification of that standard for their community that specific profile for inclusion in the registry. And I think that's something that can and should happen, because we see exactly that type of profile development happening in specific communities. One of the things that we'll have to look at is how best to address that in the standards adoption policy and the registry going forward to signal that. So, any questions or comments on where we are with the standards registry? Yeah, Mark.
My question is, based on that last point you just made, so it's the intent of the committee to get very specific about which standards specifically match the framework, rather than, like, because right now it's left open, almost like you point to the outside industry and say, pick a standard you like, but just follow this rule. But the direction that we want to go in is actually getting very specific about which standards we like and don't.
Let's put it this way. Yes, it's very general the way it is. The baseline requirement right now isn't even pointing to the standards that are in the registry. But when we even get to that point, there will be multiple standards that define a data interchange within that transaction. I'm not sure that we're going to get to recommending just one, which means we're pointing to protocols, standards that need to be used, but that still doesn't guarantee interoperability. When the point that I was making about a specific community writing a profile for their needs using those standards is they've said, all right, well, we will adopt this standards, we'll tailor it to our specific needs, but it would apply to that community.
Okay. Yeah, because one of the things that I like about the framework right now is that it does maintain a technology agnostic stance. But I think if it were also, it's just for consideration because you guys know a lot more about it than I do, but if it were somewhat standards agnostic but had binding rules or conditions around what standards kind of meet the requirement or don't, then you can kind of keep the framework safe from the up-to-date, keeping it up to date with every new standard the great thing about standards is so many to choose from, right? And there'll always be more coming along. So do we want to pin our framework to specific standards or instead just refer to them generally and let them live their own life?
Right now, the requirements in the registry are considered, I would consider them general in approach. I wouldn't necessarily say agnostic, but they're general in approach. But I think the needs of community is to take that and to build profiles or specifications on how they will use those standards. Jamie, you had a point. Oh, okay.
So the NIST cybersecurity framework was very successful, and there was a lot of adoption. There's still a lot of adoption within industry, and we within DHS get a lot of really good feedback, and we map to those standards listed in the framework as best practices that are not normative, more right. best guidelines. So I would say that maybe include some best practices, some standards within the framework that give that baseline, just like the NIST cybersecurity framework did, that are not normative but provide some baseline for industry. And also, then I have a question about how does the framework map to the NIST cybersecurity framework, at least for that access control standard. So we can probably adopt those standards that are within that NIST cybersecurity framework and also get involved in the next version. I know that NIST is going to be slightly updating the current version. Maybe that's something that we can think of.
Good, that's helpful.
Good morning. Jamie Clark from Oasis, and I've been fretting about the standards adoption policy ever since we turned out the first draft 5 years ago or so. What NIST chooses to do from the Department of Commerce to make recommendations they call best practices is a thing, and it's data. And just as with other lists, this organization should probably suck down all those standards that they're listing and make sure that they're on our list, or we know a real good reason why they're not. So it's a source. But it's a different kind of adjudication decision, and it's administrative, and it's not an industry action. And while there is a public process, it's very much, a lot of those things are coming out of NIST as guidance are very, very, while they do attempt to interact with industries, very, very much the word of government on that. Here, we're trying to do the word of industry and the community, which includes government as a stakeholder, but only one. And because of that, we'll undoubtedly often have different lists. But hopefully they're converging over time. But I've got two cautions on that. First of all, Mark, you're absolutely right. We're supposed to be technology neutral. When this project started out, one of the fundamental decisions made by the Standards Committee in its first couple of meetings was, we're not here to pick winners. There will usually, knock wood, and if open source works, be more than one way to do something. And so we're trying to set up a set of criteria that tells you it's safe to use this bag of stuff, which may have several alternatives in it, because it's from a reputable place, it's stable, it's not hooey, it seems to meet its criteria, it's not utterly captured by one vendor, and so forth and so on. But there almost always should be more than one thing in the bag, and different compositions should work. There's a further complication, though, and then I'm done. And that is that we have a bunch of evolving work going on, okay? When we started this stuff, OpenID Connect was not a standard. It had not gone anywhere. It was working. It was, we were sort of agonizing over OAuth 1 versus OAuth 2. But what were you going to do? Say, OAuth 2, poo-poo, you're not a standard, we're not talking to you? Well, no. So we have to have an on-ramp and a methodology for metabolizing these things that are coming up as standards and aren't yet, or haven't stabilized yet, or haven't been submitted somewhere yet, and are still in development. But they're nevertheless, what we want as a community to do is to give them reason to want to come play, and go the rest of the way with their IPR, and go the rest of the way with submitting to some stable host, so that they all get in the bag. So in a way, we're having to do a lot to detect some of those early projects that are probably virtuous and probably will be standards, and nudge them along, which means a slightly more forgiving approach. And you'll see that in the standards adoption policy, including the new one. We're trying to be a big dent, and that's very important. So.
Mark?
So I guess just as maybe a suggestion for consideration for the committee is that I think if we flash forward a few years, we're thinking about how does IDESG win the game, right? It's that the internet largely does business in a way that closely resembles what the framework is asking for, right? That's success, whether they're attested, not attested, registered, not registered. If we've affected the online way of doing business around identity, we won. So as we write these, I'd like you to just think about, how do I keep the bar low so that people can easily accept the framework regardless of what standard or emerging standard or potential standard they choose to use, so that they don't look at it and find it to be binary in some way. So, it was like you mentioned, OpenID Connect wasn't ready for prime time back in the day. Well, imagine if we wrote a document that was very specific and, made OpenID Connect look like an outsider. Well, we would have cut off our nose to spite our face, right? So we want to make sure we're ready for the next 10 of those, to your point, and just kind of think about those things that they become on-ramps of adoption, just to make it easy. We don't care what language everybody wants to speak, as long as they're using, they're using the framework, right? Thanks.
You need to help us with that. Okay, we're agreeing. Mark, you're right, but you need to help us with that, because what that means is, as we build out the next version of the requirements supplemental guidance and implementation guidance, we need to stuff it full of more examples. Sometimes for certain functions in the requirements, there's only one example because we only one fine standard that did it so far, or maybe even no standards yet because we're asking people to do some new stuff. But as we find more of those projects, we want to shovel them all into that so that our references are as Catholic as possible.
Okay, there's a couple things on the chat. Let me just get back.
Okay.
One sec. I think we are seeing references to approved standards in the supplemental guidance to IDESG requirements. Reference to IDESG standards also provides a shorthand way for testers to describe how they meet specific IDESG requirements.
That's absolutely true. For those that saw the display or can go online right now to see the IDEF registry and the attestation forms, one of the things that's on the attestation forms is a comment column. And those organizations that are attesting in the IDEF registry are encouraged to use that comment column. And to explain if you've implemented a standard and that justifies your determination of conformance, full implementation of the standard, certainly write that in. Get credit for it in the comments. So the comments were intended to allow the organizations that are applying to the IDEF registry to explain, for example, why a requirement might not be applicable to them, but also to explain what they've done to implement that baseline requirement that they want other organizations and the public to know. So certainly reference to standards that are in the registry or in the baseline requirements references for standards is not just appropriate, it's encouraged. Any other questions from the chat? Okay, Russ?
Yeah, this is Russ Chung. I think that the standard approval, the process that David has just talked about, implies that we start with the requirement, we come up with possibly some technologies, and then we come up with standards, and then we reach a solution. But I'm thinking that in real life, it's not that neat. It's not in that order. You know, sometimes we'll come up with technology, and then some vendors will start to market that technology, and then someone says, oh, we need a standard, and then we may or may not decide that that's a solution. So I'm thinking that this process implies a certain order, and I'm worried that in real life it doesn't happen that way. An example I can think of is Wi-Fi. We came up with all of these devices, Wi-Fi devices, and we started off with the 802.11 A, B, C, D, or Z, or whatever, and they didn't necessarily come up with an agreed upon standard. And I remember seeing boxes on the store shelves that said, this is a draft of standard, of proposed Wi-Fi standard, such and such, and they were selling product and so on. And so my concern is that this particular process implies a certain sequence which may or may not happen.
I didn't mean to imply that the process of the requirements development and the standards adoption process are sequential or linked. In fact, they're independent processes. What I did want to describe was the relationship between the two, to make sure that the baseline requirements can ultimately point to a standard as a requirement. They currently point to standards as a reference to help explain, clarify, give additional information on the baseline requirement. But the process by which standards are listed in the inventory, nominated for evaluation to the registry, and the development of the baseline requirements are separate processes. They're not linked. And by that I also mean they're independent of each other. So the baseline requirement development is not dependent upon a particular standard. The baseline requirements are developed based on function in the functional model. If there's no more questions, hopefully we've clarified the standards adoption process and what standards that do become adopted, where they go, and what that means in the registry, because I believe, Jen and Renee, we have standards up next for approval. Huh? Yes. It's on the podium.
Okay, no problem. Okay, sorry. Let me say that again. I'm not here as the plenary vice chair standing here. I'm here as the chair of the Standards Coordination Committee to go over what standards we currently have up for adoption. And that's a little overzealous because it's what standard we currently have up for adoption. So ISO 27002, and for those of you who are keenly watching the standards registry, you might notice 27001 is not up there yet. However, that one is in the queue for the privacy report, so it hopefully will be on the docket for the next plenary, or maybe approval in the middle. But 27002, as probably all of you know, based on 27001, providing guidelines for the selection, management, and application of information security controls designed to meet with an organization's security risk environment. So that came straight out of the nomination form. So to see all the various forms, so this was all done still under our SAP version 1. which has a nomination form and an evaluation form that's separate. Moving forward, we've combined that for SAP version 2. So as we start to progress standards using the new template, it'll be a single template that's got all the information. So right now, in the standards coordination area, there is a standards nominations, evals, and privacy reports folder that lists everything. So all of the nominations, evaluations, and privacy reports get posted there for all of the standards. So I just thought that was a bit easier than trying to track them all down separately. And I did confirm that at least one person who's not in my group has access to this folder. So hopefully nobody has issues if you want to get into that folder. If anyone does, let me know and we'll figure out a better place to put them. I couldn't give you a specific link for the documents because the way the documents get loaded, once you click on the document, it actually just opens. And so there's no link I can give. So take a look for the nomination form. Adam Madlin was the one who submitted for 27,002. And the evaluation form, which was approved by SEC on November 19th, is also there. So SEC went through the evaluation form and found that 27,002 is consistent with the NSTIC principles and is consistent with the additional principles. So if you look in the evaluation form, there are areas where you need to fill out consistency with NSTIC, but also 3 additional principles of relevance to the identity ecosystem, function-oriented description, and affordability. So it was deemed by consensus that 27,002 is consistent with all of those. We didn't have to evaluate ISO because ISO has been previously evaluated and adopted as a standards developer. Again, in the new SAP version 2, that piece has been taken out of the evaluation form. So there's a separate form now for evaluating a standards developer, so you don't have to keep leaving that blank like we were doing in the past. So the privacy report, again, is in the same folder, and that's the name of it, to go find it. There were no privacy issues noted, but there was a comment, and I just took a snippet of that comment because the comment is actually on, well, what is the anticipated use of standards by the members of IDESG, and it's not clear whether standards cited including 27,001, are to be considered normative or illustrative. So I'm hoping that David's speech or talk just now gives all the clarification and for those types of comments going forward. There's also a minority opinion expressed in the report. So we're not doing the voting on this standard within this plenary. There was a concern, I think, about quorum. So what we're going to do is have an electronic vote after the plenary closes. So please, everyone, go and take a look at the nomination evaluation and the minority report and read through those before you do your vote. Ultimately, even in consideration of the response from privacy with the minority opinion and the comment that was noted, there is consensus agreement within SEC to recommend 27,002 for plenary approval for adoption into the registry. And that's it. That's all I have, unless there are questions.
Hi, thank you. This is M.A. Signorino. So what we're going to do for the voting that Renee mentioned is that either tonight or tomorrow morning, you're going to get a notice. Voting members of the IDESG are going to get a notice with all the links and all the documents for the standard to be voted on. The vote will be open up for 7 days. It'll be an electronic vote, and then at the end of those days, we'll close the balloting, and then we'll have our decision. So that'll be the process for this electronic vote.
Does that cover the quorum question then, as long as it's put out to everybody, regardless of how many people actually vote?
Exactly. So according to the IDESG bylaws, if it's open for 7 days, it's assumed quorum is assumed. So, any other questions? No? Thank you.
Nothing from chat? Oh, okay. It's not on.
One question on the chat, but I actually think it relates to the discussion proceeding, was recommendations and guidance of the HIMSS task force on identity management. What is the best way to do this? And I think the question is, if there is something like a set of recommendations, guidance, or other material that's produced, can that be considered or nominated in the standards adoption process?
If it meets, so I mean, we would have to go through whatever gets nominated. If anyone has a document, specification, standard, what have you, that you would like to nominate to go through the evaluation process, we have a nomination form, a SAP version 2 new nomination / evaluation form. So let me know, and I can send that out to whoever made that comment to provide all the information for the Standards Coordination Committee to assess the nomination and take a look at the organization that, at the same time, if the standards developer that has created that document is not already an approved standards developer, which they, I think, wouldn't be in that situation, then the standards developer organization adoption form would also need to be completed because that's really first step. I mean, we'll take a look at the nomination and see if there's anything that jumps out at the group as to why there might be an issue with progressing that standard. But ultimately, the process is approve the standards developer and then review the nomination, and if the nomination is approved to go forward, have the evaluation completed. And so that really holds for anything that anyone within the IDESG wants to nominate to progress. Hopefully that answers the question. Any other ones? That's it? Okay, Jamie, you're up. Oh, sorry.
There we go. Good morning. A year ago or so, actually January of 2015, I had this slide up at a plenary asking, now what are we going to do after the first round of reading the functional requirements? And now, some months later, we're going to ask that question to God. What next? Here is the map we had up on the screen in January of 2015 in Atlanta. Second down Suite T at GTRI. And boy, watch that stuff. We had been working on developing the first set of requirements, which, as you know, we accomplished. And now we're farther along in that process. For one thing, happily, the requirements got done. They were approved in November. For another thing, TIFTM did its work to figure out what to do with the requirements and basically specified all the documents relating to the IDEF registry program. And for another thing, we created all the supplemental guidance and rules and tools and good stuff that created and is just now, Monday, delivered the IDESG registry. And a bunch of other projects have been going on, like the standards adoption policy, which was revised and improved during the course of this last year. In the meantime, because of all that, Renee's Standards Committee team has been bringing a whole bunch of additional standards to us, which are populating that registry, culminating in the ballot that's going to start on ISO IEC 27002 this next week. So that's where we've been. Where are we going? Well, first of all, we're going to get additional feedback on the requirements. We're going to hear from folks who fill out those forms, as we already have. And I can tell you, as one of the sort of the support team that was talking to our initial listers and a dozen or so that are lurching towards us that are probably going to come in soon, and we're actually trying to make it by Monday, but they're in the second wave. I can tell you there are a lot of questions about, well, what does this functional equivalence word really mean? And which of the functional model categories am I really in? And is this really a requirement? And is this really applicable to me? And what does under consideration mean? A lot of questions coming in, not just on what does the requirement say, but also how should I work with those requirements? And those are all informing. Think of every one of those questions as queuing up a Bugzilla or a Jira list behind our requirements as we find out what happens when real world users actually ask themselves those questions. So we're acquiring data, and that is going to feed back into the requirements process. At the same time, we're also doing things to promote those requirements and that assessment process into the future in the committees. The middle arrow there, TIFTM is now, and in fact we'll be meeting in an hour or so in another room to talk about this, engaged in a project of bringing in trust federations to work with us to map our requirements to theirs so that their participants who have already been assessed or certified can walk into our process with a bunch of check marks already in their report card, basically. And if you want to know about that, come to the TIFTM meeting. We're working on the functional model to make those roles clearer, to create more advice and helper tools around what they mean, and to make sure that our glossaries and our explanations are as sharp as possible. There's also a breakout for that, which you can dial into if you're remote, called functional model in a couple hours. And the standards committee is happily noodling on forward with a bunch of additional stuff in queue coming towards us. And as David said, stole my line, we suggested and the standards committee agreed that we would go back through the baseline requirements and see what all other standards are in there. Now, Mark, this kind of goes to what you were saying before. We're going to crawl through the standard, all the exemplars that are in the baseline requirement supplemental guidance. It says, you need to do data aggregation. Okay, and certainly, well, if there's a standard for that, we name it. We need to, shoo it into the registry or have a good reason why not. And then hopefully as part of that process, we'll also detect other substitutable versions. So we're going to be, basically increasing the pipeline into the standards approval process by all those references, and then going out and working more with the community to do two other things I'll just mention. One is look for more, because we don't know everything. And also, as we get a clearer map, as David sort of alluded to this, we're going to be looking for gaps. Because it may be that at the end of all that searching and looking under mattresses for standards, it may be that some of the things in the baseline requirements actually don't have a handy vendor-neutral, freely available method for doing something that's interoperable. In which case, we better run up a flag and see if we can, scope some projects and find some people to do it. So, all of which leads to more standards in the queue. Now, somebody transformed this from PowerPoint to PDF, I see, and not well, but the content's okay, so I'm going to go with it anyway. What next? Well, we're going to do more outreach. We're going to find different ways to bring people into a relationship with the registry and see why they might care to read it, or they might care to submit to it and give us a self-attestation. I told you about the trust frameworks. There's other mapping opportunities, and I want to mention that in addition to that idea of doing one-to-one, point-to-point relationships with trust frameworks, there's also the possibility that they'll be mapping to other kinds of requirements. One of them was just mentioned by the gentleman from DHS a minute ago. We should be going to look at some of your government guidance out there and see what's the list of stuff that the cybersecurity framework says that you ought to consider a best practice. Well, let's make sure we've got, whenever they are saying this is a thing you should do, that is a reasonable way to interrogate our list of things you should do and see if they're lining up. One that's been mentioned a couple times, and I think the Privacy Committee may be talking about chasing after this, although you should ask its chair. Does it make sense to map the IDESG requirements against the upcoming European GDPR, essentially a privacy regulation, which is coming to come line in another year, to see if it is true that if you fulfill our requirements, you're also compliant with the GDPR, a goal which many have and which has proved pretty elusive so far, because every time the regulators and politicians attempt to define a way to cross-certify and to define that requirement, they seem to be falling short in European courts to date. So maybe if some of the stuff we are creating, which is nicely built out and has lots of references and suggestions and standards and guidance, actually does fulfill those same principles, or we can find a mapping there, maybe that's something to talk to people about if they're trying to qualify or the GDPR. So there's mappings beyond trust frameworks. There are also the mappings to trust frameworks. And as you'll hear later today at the TIFTA meeting, our first mapping is with Kantara, with their blessing. And thank you again, Colin. I actually went to the Kantara. I was not at IDESG's meeting on Monday morning here because I was at Kantara's meeting telling them about what we were doing and seeing if we can get them excited about the business of being able to walk from a pre-existing Kantara assessment certification over to a already halfway there sort of mapping with IDESG. And I'll tell you, this is a real rough statement, and come to TIFTM if you want to know more, but I'd say, you can get to 25 to 33% of the answers in our quiz if you've already taken Colin's quiz. So it's not an insubstantial overlap. Note, though, before I leave trust frameworks, one more thing, and if you aren't a member of the trust framework, the TIFTM committee, tell them what you think. It's possible that there will be other trust frameworks that we want to go after. Some of them we may actually want to expend resources to go after. Some of them we're hoping people will use the methodology we've developed to do themselves. But if there's other collections of folks out there who are already certified that we think would be good folks to lure into our tent as well, we should be talking about where to go next in terms of trust frameworks and where we can get practical help in mapping them. And the last thing I'm going to say about trust frameworks is we were actually lucky that because the Kantara folks do third-party assessment and get a rigorous system, it's really well documented, that the subject matter expert we used, Scott David, to do the mapping, started with a great, spreadsheet kind of form. I mean, really the documents that we had from Kantara's side to allow us to map to our side were actually in really good shape. So it was relatively easy as a clerical matter to do the crosswalk because we pretty much had spreadsheets and guidance handed to us from their side to start with. So one of the criteria for how easy is it and which trust framework rules do we want to try and map to, maybe, can we get a copy of them that are relatively easy to use, and is it well specified? You could specify, you could map to the OECD privacy principles or something like that, but, do those really go deep enough to make the mapping meaningful? Open question. Anyway, so target picking for trust frameworks and other mappings. More listings. Even beyond the mapping and outreach, we obviously are in the process now of getting lots of additional people to come list with us. This week was the beginning of that process. We've got more in the pipeline. We want your help in finding others that see the value in doing so and in differentiating themselves as folks who are actually actively adopting and working towards the NSTIC principles. I think you're going to hear more from management about that. I know that the board is starting to talk about their plan for customer development, additional listing generation. And so you should expect, as information comes out between plenaries, that there'll be more on how that's going to be approached within the next month or two. More tools. This is stuff we've talked about already. But, for example, other committees continue to do the work that they've been doing all along. The UX committee, user experience, created some user experience guidelines, which they're interested in refining and revising and expanding. The privacy committee is talking about what to do with its privacy evaluation methodology, so as to build that out. And all those sorts of guidances essentially would be documentation and resources and pointers that live under the requirements and under the couple of paragraphs that we publish with them, the supplemental guidance. So that if somebody is looking at this and sees it as a good goal, but they're not there yet, and it looks a little ambitious and they need help finding tools or understanding it, they can go deep and we can get them more help. So we're trying to be Catholic and inclusive about that, but really each of the committees is going to be working on developing a larger body of useful information to go with our planned requirements support. And of course, as David and Renee were suggesting, more standards. Don't have to explain that one. A couple of things that are going to happen now that represent management decisions and decisions that they're going to need to bring back to you for recommendation, and then that this group as a community is going to have to decide. First of all, we successfully got out of our alpha testing. We got a product. It's out there. That's what the announcements were about. But now we're really in beta because with the registry, the IDEF registry, formerly known as SALS for self-assessment, we are now actively taking in additional listing parties, but we're also putting a certain amount of human effort into helping them walk through. And if you've been here this week, you've heard about that. This should, over time, result in additional feedback coming in through the concierge who's doing it and through our post-testing UX evaluation. We're doing exit interviews. And so as that goes on, there will be a period of churn during which we continue to refine the instruments, improve the FAQ, sharpen up how we hand them a widget or a spreadsheet or a checklist or a web form or however we collect the data. So there's going to be some positive churn and improvement in our method during that beta concierge period. Now, obviously, while we're doing that, the requirements aren't going to move because you can't hand somebody a list and say, check yourself against that, and then a month later come by and say, oh, by the way, we've just changed 4 other requirements. So essentially, we're going to be in a requirements freeze tool improvement period for a while. Of course, at some point in the future, we get the next issue, which is, as we get all this good feedback, which is, why aren't you guys asking us about foo? It's missing from the requirements. Or everybody on Earth has checked requirement bar as not applicable, and why are you asking, and we don't like this? Okay, and some other people are going to say, everybody says, yes, we think we do interop 4, but we have no idea what it means, so we're guessing. No disrespect to interop 4, I just picked one at random. But that kind of feedback will go back into that sort of JIRA or bug list that goes back to the committees to consider whether they want to sharpen up, add to, or modify some of those requirements. But the sequencing of that really has to be take into account whether, when we're going to really have a bolus of enough material to make a major cut. It's like a software release question, guys. How do we hold things still and get a valid sample and build up a base? How do we not go out with the message that, we're going to do 2.0 in the fall, so everybody can ignore 1.0 because it's going to change. That would be bad. But how do we keep moving through continuous improvement? So that balance of the concierge period, the freeze, and then the collection of that new information, and then the sequencing of a next release, and how we talk about it, and what we tell people, and whether we go back to, if all the listings we're taking are good for a year, does that mean we don't pester anybody that listed with us until the end of their year? So there's a series of release and sequencing questions, which are important, and which will be something that I'm sure Tifton will talk about. It's something I'm sure the committee should give feedback on, and ultimately, it's something management's going to have to kick around in their plans for this year. And then finally, once you get past that was all self-assessment. We get back, and I wonder if I don't think this thing reverses, does it? Let's see if it does. See if I'm like, oh yeah, all right. Yeah, I know I get excited by small technological successes. There was up there always a plan to come to third-party assessment. That's that check right there. And so another project on top of what I just described has to be layered into this, and it's a conversation that's starting within TIFTM, and I think we're at least going to have a little bit of chat about it today, David, at the TIFTM breakout after this, is what more do we need to add into our assurances, our documentation, our agreements, and the ecosystem in order to create a third-party assessor certification system where instead of self-assessment, we actually have a company that's able to go and get some third party to tell them whether they're in compliance with the requirements or not. Big project, also has some sequencing issues, like when do you stop focusing on self-assessment? Involves some things we probably haven't fully worked out yet, but that's where we decided we were going a couple years ago as a community. So that's going to be another one of the big next project timing issues, and that is also something, at least at the beginning, we'll start talking about at TIFTM this afternoon. And unless anybody has any questions, that's all I have. We are where we hoped to be. We are moving forward. We have a lot to do with the committees. Bless you for continuing to help us work through things as experts in those committees, and it's going to be a fun year. Thanks. Renee, do I have, unless you've got questions I don't know about, I think I'm done. Okay.
Jamie, what are the IDESG plans to increase the value of being in the registry? Will IDESG help market the services of testers in the registry or use of the ID ecosystem?
Well, hold off on, quote, services of the testers, because that's a distinct topic, which I'll do second. But on topic one, I think that's actually management's top priority right now, is to figure out what to do to make it a worthwhile thing for people to take the pledge. One of our biggest concerns, speaking just sort of generally and vaguely for the whole organization, was that we were asking people to do a report card. And, you know, I mean, they're going to be turn in a report card that isn't all A's. They're going to say, yeah, we're part of the way. We're doing this. We're doing some of that. We're not doing this yet. We're working on it. And I think there was a concern in our minds and in the community that companies might find that adverse. They don't want to really say, hey, we're not all the way there yet. But the message we've managed, apparently, to get out successfully, given that people are listing and others are banging on the door trying to list, is that it's okay to report interim progress towards a set of worthwhile but very ambitious goals. Nobody, I mean, just as the cybersecurity people say, you know, there's never a bug-free system. You're never all the way there. Nobody has 100, it's not possible, I don't think, to be 100% compliant with all these requirements today. We don't even have some of the technology in place to confirm some of the things that we'd like to see people do in a deterministic way. But companies are finding advantage, and you heard Kim interviewing some of our early listers over the last couple days, in taking the pledge and saying, yes, these are the goals we're trying to set. We're trying to differentiate ourselves by bringing the NSTIC principles into life in a testable, implementable way in our offerings. So what we're hoping is that we can do more to kind of provide cover and support for that, and to get support from our policy partners to tell folks that if they want to get on that horse, it's a good thing, and it's going to be generally recognized as the path for future, safe, desirable, fraud preventative, privacy enhancing, usable services. So how exactly ISD is going to do that, and IDSG's work to promote that, is really the next major step for management to come back to you with, and I think you'll be hearing more within about a month on that. But it's definitely top of the stack. MA, have you been hearing me? Does that all sound right? Okay. Promotion of listing and the value of listing, top item for the near future. Yes. Good. Okay. Anything else? Mark, did you have something there? Let the nice lady hand you the mic.
Oh,
Okay.
that's right. I forgot there's people online. My apologies, everybody on the internet. I think it should be one of the things we add to the marketing committee list of work product, that we continue to build out a library or a kit, if you will, that, you know, if anybody that goes through this, you know, obviously the mark is nice, and having the right to use the mark to indicate that your service or product or whatever is registered and you've self-attested is great, but we probably can build out a little bit more of a robust kit that if you come through, you know, these tools are kind of waiting for you on the other side of the finish line after you finish attesting and registering yourself. So I don't know, Joanne, maybe we can take that as an action to bring back to the marketing committee, that we figure out a way to kind of step our way in logically into something that, you know, some of the small lift stuff first, and then maybe we get a little cuter after that. Make sense?
Okay, good. And you know, elevator pitch version of Mark's point, we need to work on the marketing of what this mark means. And I mean, look, we're getting our mind around this. Okay, Kim Sutherland probably just spontaneously came up with a better line than anybody else had come up with when she came up with the phrase transparency mark the other day. And as we do more of this, we're learning what it really means and what we should call it and how to explain it to mortals. So moving forward, can I ask who, for members, maybe not board members, who want to know what's going on with the marketing effort, or who wants to participate or contribute something in sections, who's our point of contact for marketing activity?
It's changing.
For now. I'm just looking for if you have questions, see person.
Right now, if you have questions in the transition, you could reach out to me or to Sal.
Okay,
We're
so
bringing on
Sal
a whole
D'Agostino or Mark DeFreya.
Yeah, we're bringing on a whole new bunch of folks. We just did new committee alignment, and with the elections, the committee structure changed a little bit.
I'm putting these guys on spot right after they did their board elections. So they're like, geez, am I a chair now or what? But yeah, but what the message I want to get out and make sure is on the record is if members or stakeholders have an interest in that sort of marketing angle or what the trust mark means, see Sal or Mark for now.
You got it.
And we'll be delegating more, knock wood, soon. Good. Ray, anything else? Excellent. Thanks very much. those guys who leave the stage and do the drop the mic thing. I mean, do they break the mic? Do they have special rubber mics? How's that work? I don't want to take that chance. No.
So I think we have come to the end of our agenda, MA, and Jen isn't back yet from her session that she's giving. So I'm going to pretend I'm Jen just for a minute. Reminding everyone that we have the breakout sessions this afternoon. I believe they start at 12:30 and go till 2 as they did yesterday. There's the rooms. Please join. And even though our plenary is closing, please go take those sessions in. And the 17th IDESG plenary is officially closed. Unless there are questions. Sorry, Jamie. Oh, a reminder, yes, there is a box lunch as there was yesterday, so you can pick that up and take that with you to the sessions. David, do you want to come get the microphone? There's one over there too.
Can we accelerate that schedule? The
I don't think so because I think we have the room assignments.
Huh? And by accelerate the schedule, I mean it's now 11 o'clock.
Right. Right.
All
Sorry,
right.
you're out of luck. The rooms are booked from 12:30 on and are being used, so we won't be able to do that. So thank you everyone on the phone and in person for coming to the plenary, and hope to see you in the breakout sessions this afternoon. Thank you.